So welcome to everyone. I'm really happy to be here tonight for one of the last events in this, what has been a really rich and really enriching Black History Month Florence in our 6th edition. My name is Justin Randolph Thompson, and I am the co-founder and director of Black History Month Florence, which is an initiative that is designed really to be a cross-institutional network of people in dialogue with each other in order to expand the ways in which we understand and think about Afro-descendant cultures in the space of Italy and its connection to the rest of the world. Tonight, I'm joined by Julia Bolton Holloway, who is someone I've collaborated with over the years. I think since our 2nd edition, we've been in dialogue. We were introduced by Mark Robbins from the British Institute. And it was really an introduction to thinking about a moment in history that is often overlooked in regards to Florence. And it's the moment of abolition and really thinking about the abolition of slavery and the ways in which so many different countries come together in order to really sort of narrate and drive the fight against the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of peoples. The English Cemetery is this site that really contains so many layers of that history. And Julia has been so generous over the years in really sharing all of the different facets that are specifically there in that site, in that land, and everything that she's done since over the past few years, over the past many years now, to really think about how to extend that narration beyond its history into contemporary times and to connect to moments and reflections that have to do with oppression right now, and that could connect many different cultures in the same ways in which the cemetery and the graves do. So tonight, we're particularly happy to have this conversation that is titled "The Color of Stone," which is a title that is intended to be, I guess, a little bit provocative in regards to really thinking about the ways in which color and stone maybe are overlooked also in terms of the impact that they have in our forming values in culture, especially within the art historical canon. And the title actually is drawn from Charmaine Nelson's 2007 book, which is called The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America. And one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about this book, which covers so much terrain, it's kind of thinking about the neoclassical development of whiteness in sculpture through just simple color. And it's really thinking about that through the ways in which the fact that most sculpture from Roman antiquity was indeed painted. And so we've sort of removed that. And so there's this further romanticization of the whiteness of that stone, which wasn't actually a part of its origin. And so it's particularly powerful because she also starts to dive into the ways in which certain comparisons, also thinking about Iram Powers, who is buried at the English Cemetery, in dialogue with like the sculptures of Edmonia Lewis, which creates a really intriguing contrast and dialogue that I'm sure that we'll be diving into tonight. So without going too far, I want to go ahead and pass the mic over to Julia. Thank all of you for joining us. And thank you, Julia, so much for thinking about this event as a way of continuing our collaboration.
Right. If we could go to share screen and can you this is also it's a collaboration between Black History Month and the Academia Bessarian, and this is our 5th conversation, and this one is on decolonialism. Black is beautiful, and we begin with these. Can you do the next slide? Next slide. Right. The Western canon of literature and Florence and Black is beautiful, women's novels, Black Lives Matter. This is the index that I've given for the new humanities. I don't think we need to obliterate the classics, but we do need to understand the Black African presence and base of our Western culture, which we have whitewashed out of the picture. Next slide. And I would like to begin with Terence Publius Terentius Afer, who is African. He was an ex-slave, and in Rome, he was writing comedies in the style of Menander, the Greek playwright. And in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, everyone was taught in school his plays, whereas I was taught as an imperial English child Caesar's Gallic Wars. And in Terence, it's make love, not war. They're wonderful. The women and slaves come out on top. And Cicero takes his phrase of, creates out of it the word humanitas. Roswitha, who is a German nun, rewrites the comedies in the style of the Egyptian desert fathers, and especially about women. The Benedictines used him in liturgical dramas. Dante, his son says, takes the title of the Commedia from Terence's comedies and also creates the theatre of the Commedia, the circle and the terraces are all based on the Roman theatre of Terence. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with the characters telling tales. Montaigne's Boccaccio writes out all of Terence. Montaigne's essays has the wonderful phrase on his study ceiling, Shakespeare knew Terence. Moliere's Tartuffe, which was acted before Louis XIV, is where the servant girl, Dorine, saves the family from this horrible hypocrite, Tartuffe, who is destroying the family. And we need to remember that Christianity is the religion of women and slaves. Next slide. This is Terence, and I'm really angry that Penguin went and changed this cover to one that is not correct at all. It's just a piece of white marble in a grotesque form, whereas this image of from the Egyptian encaustic portraits done in wax on the mummies is extremely correct for the title. And Terence would create all of these characters with masks, the women, the young virgin who is about to be married, the lover, the prostitute with the heart of gold, and the angry patriarchal father whom everyone conspires against to have the play end happily, and so forth. On to the next one. And these are more scenes from the Terence plays, going way back in time. This is in the Vatican, this is in the Bodleian, and then we go on through to the Renaissance. But they're showing the actions just as Dante will also do and his illustrations in the Commedia. Next one. This is the setup of the theatre with the Roman circle, Calliope, the music, Terence presenting his plays, and so forth. And this is the woodcut, where you see the halls of the theatre outside the theatre and the theatrum and so on, which ends up being the Globe Theatre of Shakespeare. Next one. And more scenes like this, the Luçon Master, the same with the Roman theatre and Calliope and so on. Next one. And again, this is a play of the eunuch, which is they're hilariously funny. But they're not cruel. They're not like Plautus's plays. They have a civility and a kindness to them. This is all pre-Christian. I'm sorry about the ambulance going by. Next slide. More of the comedies of Terence, which were commented upon by Madame Dacier. Women especially thrilled to Terence's plays because of their liberation themes, where it's like Jane Austen's novels where things end happily. You get married to the right person and so on. Next one. And then Montaigne, on his study ceiling, uses a line from the Heauton Timorem Romanus, Homo sum, humani a me nihil alienum puto. I am a man, therefore nothing human is alien or strange to me. It is the expression of humanitas. And there is his study in the tower in near Bordeaux. Next slide. And then we had those influences, and I was very grateful to Lucy Walker, who has the Eden Theatrical Workshop in Denver. I was on the Colorado Endowment for Humanities, and she had presented a proposal for acting a Terence play for Black History Month. And around the table, I was the last person. Everyone said, "What has Terence to do with Black History Month?" No one realized that he was Black and African, etc. It finally got to me. I've been sitting on my hands, just, and I blurted out, but Terence is African," and so she was given the grant. We did the plays, and then, as my golden parachute, I asked for a graduate seminar that I taught at Boulder, University of Colorado, on Terence through time, while she was doing her theatre group with, for instance, New Rise Battle, with this wonderful name, was one of the Black actors and so forth. And I just hope she's amazing. Next slide. Apuleius is also African, and Boccaccio again writes out all of his texts. And he influences Chaucer, Shakespeare, Pushkin, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and also Leslie Marmon Silko in her Storyteller has a story that's exactly like his, Cupid and Psyche. Pushkin and Elizabeth Barrett Browning are both part Black, and so they especially thrill to Apuleius. And he is excellent. He's a wonderful writer to read. And he sees the world from the perspective of the ass. Next slide. He sees how badly slaves are treated. He sees a scene where the Roman comes up to the slave and demands money. The slave doesn't have the Latin language, and he gets beaten up because this is exactly the situation my Roma get into, where they can't read the documents the police make them sign and so forth, the absolute cruelty of power versus powerlessness. Now, this is a harp, 2500 BC in Ur of the Chaldees, and it has the ass playing the harp. And that, next slide, again in 1200 AD, you have the same ass playing the harp. And this story of the ass, it's also, people don't realize that when Dante writes the Commedia, he's playing the game of being the stupid student who hasn't learned his lessons from Virgil and plucks the branch and so on and so forth. The topos of the author pretending to be the fool and less knowledgeable than the reader was an excellent device for education. And that's what Apuleius did in the Golden Ass, where he has the stupid hero, Lucius, gets converted into the ass because he fouls up a magic potion to win his girlfriend. And it all goes very badly wrong until finally he gets to eat roses. Next slide. And the story that is told in the center of the story, the tale within tales, is that of Cupid and Psyche. And this is a sculpture by Carnarvon, which actually has, the next slide, these beautiful, delicate wings. And this is Lord Leighton's painting of Psyche taking her bath in Cupid's palace, whom she's not allowed to see. And this story, this beautiful love story where Venus is very jealous and won't allow Cupid to have Psyche, and she finally wins her way to have his love by doing all kinds of tasks that are impossible, and everyone helps her because she's kind and beautiful. And that story is told by the old woman to the two lovers who've been captured by the robbers in the cave. And she tells it as a consolation story to them. And then the lovers are killed by the robbers, and she hangs herself while the robbers eat the meal that she has cooked. And next slide. This is the painting by John Rodman Spencer Stanhope, who buries his daughter beside Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb. And he imagines her, she died at 7, as if she had lived to 17. And we read Elizabeth Barrett Browning's translations of Apuleius into poetry. And my Italian actress who has red hair, we dressed her like John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's painting. That is owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I would love to be able to contact him with more information about the tomb that's connected with it. Next slide. Apuleius influences all of these people. Next slide. Florence, and black is beautiful. Justin Randolph Thompson has given wonderful talks on Duke Alessandro de' Medici, who was the son of the black slave and the very last real Medici. Florence's Swiss owned cemetery was open to everyone who wasn't Catholic. Now it's even open to Catholics, which meant that it has a black slave buried here. It has many abolitionists buried here. It has people who owned slaves and who owned serfs in Russia and so forth. Frances Trollope, she's buried here, and she writes a wonderful novel against slavery, which she witnessed firsthand going up the Mississippi from Louisiana to Cincinnati. It's called Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, and its hero, anti-hero, is just like Trump. And he's very much a white supremacist from poor white trash. And she's modeling it on Joseph Henry Fielding's Jonathan Wild. Iram Powers, she meets him in Cincinnati. He's part Native American. And she gets him to do Dante in waxworks on the American frontier. And then they both end up in Florence years later. And he is professor of sculpture, white marble, in the Accademia, the Belle Arti. Sarah Pelka Raymond, I will go into the images next. I think if we go on to the images, next slide, Duke Alexander. Next slide. This tomb is of Henrietta Maria Hay, who is the daughter of Robert Hay, the Egyptologist, and the Greek Kalitsa Saraki, ex-slave of the Turks, whom he bought in the slave market in Alexandria and married, and brought her home to Scotland, where they restored a castle together. And then he went bankrupt. But his daughter came to Florence and lived in Casa Guidi. And so our cemetery is filled with slaves, with serfs, with servants, with nobles, etc. It's a wonderful mixture of people. Next slide. William and Mary Somerville. She's buried in Naples. He's buried with us. She writes in her autobiography that she wished she could live, and she's in her late 90s, the last years of her life. She wished she could live to see the end of the pernicious form of slavery. She's responsible for the invention of our computer. She taught Ada Lovelace mathematics. Self-taught, no schooling, brilliant mind. She wasn't allowed to be a member of the Royal Society because she was a woman. So they made her husband, William Somerville, who's buried with us, and her son members, and put a bust up of her. Next slide. So William Henry Sewell is actually the natural son of King William IV. And the tombs are interesting because this is his wife, Georgiana, he, and then their servant, James Banfield, and all the tombs are equal. And on the servant's tomb is said, more than a servant, a friend, more than a friend, a brother, which is from the epistle, the Philemon by Paul in the Bible. So we have king's sons insisting on equality. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, or blow all class walls level as Jericho's. Next slide. This is Fanny Trollope, who journeyed up the Mississippi and who wrote Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. Tonight, we have many members of the Trollope Society in our audience who have come because of her. And they also published, we edited together Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. It's a wonderful read, and it has one of its characters. She's amazing. She is a black slave. Her mistress had taught her to read, and she was reading everything, especially Shakespeare. So then she ends up being the slave of Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, and she terrifies him by pretending to be mad and reciting Shakespeare at him, and he doesn't know how to cope. And the white hero, the real hero, is actually lynched because he has taught the slaves to read and write, which was forbidden. Next slide is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She is part black. She's from Jamaica. Her family owned slaves. They also gave me, the family relatives, this book, which has the list of the slaves they owned and the characteristics of them on their Jamaican plantation. They were extremely wealthy, and then when the slaves were freed, they went into comparative poverty. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the sick room with TB, and she wrote. She was very concerned about children in mines and factories, and she then eloped with another poet, Robert Browning, escaped from London at 40. She never told her husband her age. And she actually, after several miscarriages, had a baby. But during one of the failed pregnancies, she wrote The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. It is a tremendous poem against slavery, where the black woman has been raped by her white master. She sees the baby's face, has the face of the master, and she kills it. And then she is surrounded by those accusing her. She says, "Drop that stone," which is from the Bible. "Let the man without sin cast the first stone." And she both blesses and curses America for its slavery. Um, we are now republishing it in Italian. And I've said that both times the covers are non-negotiable. It's got to be Michelangelo's Aurora, which Elizabeth identifies with, the tragedy of the figure of Aurora. That Michelangelo wrote the poem against the tyranny of the Medicis for when they returned the Black Prince and so forth. And with the bandiera. Next slide. Elizabeth's tomb, designed by Frederick Lord Leighton. Camoni has given it the laurel wreath. And I was able to identify the drawings by Lord Leighton for the tomb. And this is the harp of Exodus with the broken slave shackle on the back. Robert didn't censor that, but he did censor her portrait. He decided she was ugly, so he has the exact opposite of her, not the spaniel locks, not the Creole features, but instead white marble, hair swept behind her ears, etc. They're completely unrecognizable, and people can't find the tomb because he paid for the name. He just paid for EBB. He was too cheap to pay for her full name. And Leighton paid for the tomb and was furious that his design was altered. Next slide. And this is the Scotsman Hugh MacDonald, who was actually enslaved in Morocco when he was British consul there. And there was a huge war. Admiral Pellew was able to win his freedom and end that part of slavery going on in the Mediterranean. And he's buried with us. Next slide. And here's Iram Powers, the sculptor. And this is his visiting card, which is in a diary in the British Institute that he has signed. And a very simple tomb that his son designed, like the one his father had designed for three of their children. Next slide. And these are his sculptures. The Greek slave, the last of her tribe, because he's part Native American. She's being pursued to be raped by white men. And then his Statue of America, which I consider more beautiful than the Statue of Liberty. It got shipwrecked, and we only have the plaster cast of it. But these sculptures, with those of Edmonia Lewis, are together in the Smithsonian. And it was an absolutely wonderful experience seeing them there all together. Also with William Wetmore Story, who designs the tomb for Theodore Parker, commissioned by Frederick Douglass. Next slide. This is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnet to this sculpture. They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anguish. On the threshold stands an alien image with the shackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the sculptor meant her that passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed, not darkened, where the still expand, to so confront men's crimes in different lands with man's ideal sense, pierce to the centre art's fiery finger, and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face not alone East Greece, but West, and strike and shame the strong by thunders of white silence overthrown. And we call our book on the cemetery and its white marble tombs, White Silence. But I think we need to see white in an ironic way, that it's whitewashes the truth out of the picture, that it is the whitest sepulchre of the Bible, and we have to break through that to get to the truth that really classical statues were brilliantly colored, not white marble only, and so forth, to celebrate color instead of just whiteness, which is no color at all, it's nothing. Next slide. This is Champollion Rossellini in Egypt and Nubia with all of their loot, amongst which was a 15-year-old girl slave, Nadezhda Nesantis, and they brought her back from Nubia. She dies in her 30s after being freed by Rossellini's uncle, and she's baptized Greek or Russian Orthodox, which is why she has the Russian Orthodox cross, the only one that's permitted by the Swiss in the cemetery, who force all of the noble Russians to only have Latin crosses, which must have really annoyed them immensely. Next slide. Johann Cantacuzene, my Roma, identified him as the Romanian nobleman, descendant of the emperors of Constantinople, who owned them as slaves, because Europe also practiced slavery. And the people who have restored the cemetery with me are those descendants. And they were freed with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin the next year in Romanian, published in Iași in Romania. Next slide. Frederick Douglass visited here, and this is his handwritten diary in the Library of Congress. He came to see the tombs of Theodore Parker, Richard Hildreth, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, to honor them for their work against slavery, 11th of May, 1887. Next slide. And this is his study with statues of Spartacus and Jesus Christ on his desk. This is him visiting Lloyd Garrison's tomb. He made a habit of visiting tombs and honoring them. And this is the tomb he commissioned by William Wetmore Story, who also is a sculptor of that wonderful weeping angel in the Roman Protestant cemetery, which he designed for his wife. And the epitaph on the tomb is the one that Frederick Douglass wrote, that he freed mankind from slavery and superstition. Next slide. Richard Hildreth is also buried here, and I've got these wonderful copies, Italian translation of his novel, The White Slave. This is the scene in The White Slave. The last daughter where the children of the slaves are sold away from their parents. And this is still going on in Florence. We've just won the Supreme Court case in Rome for two Roma parents to finally be allowed to see their four children who were taken from them by a ruse. It's a child market, and if the children are blonde, they are, likely prey for this commerce. This It's a baby market, and I was very grateful. We had a wonderful human rights lawyer who has helped us, Avvocato di Strada, all the way up through the Italian Supreme Court, and then next will be Strasbourg. But it's been 7 years, and the parents have only been allowed to see their children once. And the children had been told that the parents didn't love them, that they abandoned them. So this gets internalized by children in adoption if they think they weren't loved, and it damages them enormously. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. The most important thing in the family is that the parents love their children and the children know that. Next slide. Frederick Douglass. And this was actually incised by Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu, whose ancestors were slaves and whose family were then in the Holocaust. And he inscribed the tombstone, the memorial plaque. Frederick Douglass, ex-American slave, came here 11th of May, 1887. And we've repeated the iris of Frederick Lord Leighton. And the Roma have planted the cemetery with Florence's irises, which are Florence's lily. Next slide. And then I gave this talk on Sarah Parker Raymond, this Black woman doctor who arrived with a letter from Mazzini to study medicine at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital after having lectured against slavery in America and in London. And these are various important figures in medicine who were working against the filth that medical men used to practice when they did surgery. Many of our women buried here died in following childbirth because of puerperal fever, because of dirty hands. Something which we're beginning to learn about with COVID. Next slide. And women were generally relegated to only being nurses, not doctors. But they were the ones keeping things clean. Princess Belgiojoso was running the hospitals for Garibaldi. Margaret Fuller came from America, had a baby out of wedlock while working for Princess Belgiojoso. Jessie White Mario, with her flaming red hair, was wonderful. She was running hospitals for Garibaldi. Florence Nightingale. And then we have Octavia Hill, who's the daughter of Thomas Southwood Smith, who's buried here. And she's the one who starts the slum clearances in London and so forth, and also the National Trust. And on his tomb is the need for fresh air and sunlight in the homes of the poor. And then the last one is Dr. James Barry, who pretended he was a man. And they only found out that she was a woman when the charwoman went to wash her body to lay it out. And not only that, that she'd had a child. And she was head of the military hospitals in England. And also she was succeeded by Sir David Dumbreck in the Crimea, who is buried here. Next slide. And this is Sarah Parker Raymond, who was a great friend of Frederick Douglass. And her story is magnificent. Next slide. We asked the Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. She was friends with Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini. We asked Santa Maria Nuova Hospital if Daniel could make a plaque about her getting her doctorate there at a time when no women could. And they said, oh no, we're all protected by the Belliati. They would never allow it. We're going to go on trying to get that plaque there. Next slide. She studied obstetrics in the Ospedale degli Innocenti, where the doctors practice with the poor women who were having babies out of wedlock. Next slide. Women's novels. We, because we're in a subordinate position, identify often with the situation of injustice. Francis Trollope's Jonathan Jefferson White Law, that is unjust law because it's in favor of the whites against the blacks. Harriet Beecher Stowe copies both Francis Trollope and Richard Hildreth and writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this is the little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War, said Lincoln. And the Brontes, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Sargasso Sea, which is copying them, really has this backdrop with Rochester and also with Heathcliff as the slaves and so forth who return to England and so on. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. I used to keep, when I was a child, my copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin next to Gone with the Wind because I was interested in the sort of dialectic between the two novels. One is in favor of slavery and the other against it. I heard Leslie Silko speak at the Harvard conference of the English Institute on Changing the Canon, where also Houston Baker and many other wonderful writers spoke about the need for Black perspectives, Native American perspectives. And there was one point with Leslie Fiedler was talking about this women, Jew and Black. When a Black scholar in the back row got terribly upset and said that women should not be allowed in the profession because we would lower the standards and the pay. And I went to the back row and I took him by the hand and I walked down to the front and I took Leslie Fiedler's hand and I said, look, we are Leslie Fiedler's book, The Strangers in Shakespeare, the woman, the Jew and the slave. And our voices need to be heard together. Laura Fish wrote this novel called Strange Music. It's a fine novel. It's against the slavery practice in Jamaica by Elizabeth Barrett Browning's brother, Samuel Stormy. She is part of the Me Too situation before Me Too. The poet laureate of England, Andrew Motion, harassed her sexually. She protested and she got destroyed. And if you read the novel, it is about whites destroying Black women. And I've been trying to find Laura Fish. We both gave papers back to back at Baylor years ago. And I just want to reach out to her because this novel is more true to the Barrett family, and the Barretts own up to their history and try to make amends for it. The Browning Society does not. They don't want to know about it, so they whitewash things. Catherine Adoyo's Reign. I hope Catherine is with us tonight. Is magnificent. We did a wonderful series of discussions together on it. It is decolonialism. She's from Kenya and she's speaking against Vasco da Gama, the romanticism, which actually is the whitewashing of tremendous abusive genocide. And then the novel, which I love, is Ijabo Shega, La Linea del Colore. It's being translated into English now. Her heroines are Sarah Parker Raymond and Edmonia Lewis. She makes a composite of them. They come to Italy, to Florence, and this character comes to the English cemetery. And she says at Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb, the lines from Theodore Parker, the arc of the moral compass bends slowly, but it bends towards justice, which Theodore Parker said, then Martin Luther King said, then Barack Obama put on the carpet of the Oval Office, which Trump threw out, of which Biden had brought it back in. And he also had said it at Nelson Mandela's funeral in South Africa. Next slide. These are the novels. Francis Trollope. All of these are available on Amazon and so forth. Next slide. Strange Music, Harriet Beecher Stowe, etc. These are powerful novels that actually change history. And these are the voices of the powerless who were able to speak to the injustice and seek to undo it. Except Laura Fish, I hope that she can pull through the trauma she went through, because it was really appalling. Next slide. And our Roma families, this is a slave village in Romania, owned by the Cantacuzens, these nobles. And then the next slide, the broken shackle, the slave selling poster for 18 men, 10 young men, 7 women, etc. Free children. Selling people. Remember, the Russians measured their wealth in how many souls they owned of their serfs. Next slide. And here the Roma are learning from the daughters of my ordinand I was tutored to, how to do the letter carving. And then they did the Frederick Douglass, ex-American slave, came here. Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu is amazing. He was actually restoring Donatello's pulpit in Prato. He's so excellent. Next slide. And this is the Dennis Looney's book, Freedom Readers, Sarah Parker Raymond's plaque, which is put up in the Roman cemetery. I found that she was buried there by looking at the page of my ancestor, who was an Irish artist in Rome, Richard Rothwell, and they were on the same page. And this is what we would like to have in Santa Maria Nuova. Next slide. And this is my son's book. He died a year ago, only 62. And Henry Louis Gates is doing this wonderful documentary. I wish I could see it, on Black Church documentary. In Oakland, I was registering Blacks to vote, and this was organized in the Black churches. The Black churches are filled with the love of the support, the consolation in the face of adversity. And the Christianity is much deeper there than it is with the whites. Next slide. Black Lives Matter, Together Let Us Sweetly Live, is the title of my son's book. And this is not just blacks and whites. This is why I say all lives matter. Dalits, Hindu castes, Hindu, Muslim, Rohingyas, Muslim, Buddhist, Uyghurs, Muslim, communists, Aborigines, settlers, Native Americans, settlers, African Americans, enslavement, Catholics, Protestants in Ireland, Irish, Italians, Poles, because they're Catholic in America, just end up being pizza cooks instead of Michelangelos and Donatellos. The Sami and the Swedes, the Roma and the Gage. The Gage is a word for us. Gentiles, Jews, Palestinians, Zulu, Boer, Anglos, apartheid. Also, the oral culture is despised by the scribal one. So my illiterate Roma, who are very intelligent, are considered to be like garbage. This displacement from humanity, from equality, the Me Too, etc. It could be with religions, races, genders, nations, indigenous, nomads, settlers. But all of these are against justice. This is why I love Justin having his name, Justin, because it is the right name to have. Next slide. So Publius Terentius Afer, before Christ, wrote Homo sum, humani nihil a me alienum puto. Next slide. This is the Academia Bessarion, and now it's time for discussion. And I hope Catherine Adoyo is with us. Can we do the vista of the screens so we can see all the people? And Galleria.
So you can see the list of attendees down below if you just click on participants. So we don't see their screens, but they can write in the Q&A box. So I invite all of you to write your questions. We have one question that's already here from Anya Lang, which the question is, which comedy by Terence would you recommend for freshman students?
I'm one of the problem groups. I'm deaf. And so could you repeat that question?
Of course. Sorry about
Yes.
that. First off, thank you so much for the presentation and for really going through so many layers of history. The question that is in the Q&A box is by Anya Lang. And the question is, which comedy by Terence would you recommend for freshman students?
All of them, but probably Gaeta is the best one. And they are all splendid. They're a little bit complicated. They expect you to be intelligent. Because the plot lines, they sort of do double plots, which also the Elizabethan playwrights will play with. I would suggest all 6 of them. Plunge in. They're wonderful. And do it with a parallel text from the Loeb classics. But also, I do need to point out that the translations into English are incorrect when they have the slaves say sir to the masters. That's not there in the Latin. Roman slaves could buy their freedom. They were more educated than their masters, and they were the scribes like Cicero's Tiro, who wrote down his orations. And it's just what I found so difficult when Lucy Walker was doing the Terence plays was the black actors were terrified of saying some of the cheeky lines that Roman slaves could say, because in America there's still this fear of the most horrible punishment of lynching. It's still with us, and somehow we've got to learn to undo that. Next question.
Yeah, there's another less a question, more of a comment from Dennis Looney. And it says, thanks so much. Wonderful talk. Just to add a note, Trollope comes to the US at the end of 1827 at the behest of another fierce abolitionist, Francis Wright, to help with building up Neshoba outside Memphis, a utopian community meant to educate freed slaves. Trollope didn't stay long and went from there to Cincinnati, where she created another kind of utopian classroom, Infernal Regions, the Dante Wax Museum from 1828 to 1830 with Iram Powers. Thanks again.
Yes, Dennis, I love your book. It's called Freedom Readers, and it's on the Black reading of Dante as liberation. And that is the way to read Dante. He is about, when you get to the Celestial Rose, there's no hierarchy. They're all equal, men and women, Old Testament and New Testament. And this is the utopia. We can all be individuals with different cultures, with that richness. But none of us have the right to consider ourselves superior to the other.
So Karen Mitchell has a hand up. I think maybe just, I think I can.
I wish we could see them.
I think we can unmute. Let's see if this works. Karen, I think that you can speak now if you want to unmute yourself.
Right. Karen, What is your question? Karen and I were with Adoyo on rain.
Hi, yes, I was just typing it out myself, so I'm sorry I hit a key too early. But I am fascinated by the period of time between when the statues were painted and when they
Yes.
became all symbolic of the white supremacy. Do you have a book, or can you recommend a book that might discuss that, what was going on that resulted in that transition?
Justin can answer that one.
I guess so. I mean, the book that the talk takes its title from, The Color of Stone, definitely talks about this. But there's been also a number of exhibitions. I think that there's a catalog from an exhibition that was in the the Market of Trajan, that was called Colored Stone. And it was looking specifically at the use of colored stone in Roman statuary, but then it also talks about painted stone. But I think that there's a lot of writing, extensive writing about this. And if you go also to a lot of archaeological museums, including the Archaeological Museum in Florence, you also see it not just in Roman statuary, but also in Etruscan statuary, because there are still existent stone
Pigments.
pieces that are painted. Because of course, being buried, being protected in tombs, there's ways in which they've survived through now. But The Color of Stone is a really great book for sort of thinking about the implications of this. And I think that there's a lot of ways to also look at, there's some intriguing images that were brought to us through by many artists, that sort of testify to the ways in which spaces like the Roman Forum, which now, is considered, of course, really this sacred zone, was a space that had actually animals grazing and was overgrown, right? And so, there's a long period where these are just spaces that are kind of buried. And so the re-emergence of those things, the excavation, the re-displaying of these objects, right, are hand in hand also with a reconsideration of what they signify. There's some really intriguing writing inside the book, The Color of Stone. And actually, I had a question for you, Julia, just in terms of thinking about one of the layers in relation to this book, The Color of Stone, that I think is specifically points to the Greek Slave by Iram Powers. And it talks about the fact that when we see that sculpture, there's also race and racism is being played into that sculpture as well, in that the imaginary of the white slave, here titled The Greek Slave, is also connected to an Arab slave market. And so what happens when we put into that equation the imagery of who has this slave and the cultural implications of, how this is intended to sort of spark a certain empathy, right, amongst whites.
Right. It's the White Slave and Elizabeth Barrett's sonnet. She grew up in a house built with slave wealth by her father when he was quite young and very wealthy, and his guardian was Scarlett, who was working with Lord Ashley. But he built that house like a Muslim. It had minarets and crescent moons because the Turks owned slaves. The Ottoman Empire practiced slavery. Remember the Scottish archaeologist, Egyptologist with his wife, he bought in the slave market in Alexandria. And she was aware of this, and she was thrilling to Byron and his work against liberating Greece. And the sadness is that the very last document she writes is selling the ship, the former slave ship, which became the convict ship to Africa, the David Lion, the Scots and slavery and marmalade and everything, sugar and so forth, were all interconnected. And her mother was from Scotland and a part of that scene. whereas her father actually was Jamaican slave owning stock. And so she grew up with this extraordinary wealth, this gorgeous library of classics. But she was reading into those classics that opposite meaning about freedom, not the Boris Johnson spouting forth Greek, to show off of Eton, but instead the vision of freedom, eleutheria, which is the word that Socrates never used, and so on and so forth, because he loved Sparta, which was a slave owning culture. But I was horrified when I realized that actually she was living off that slave ship's ship money for her laudanum. She was implicated. And I used to think that my husband, American husband, was from his family owned slaves in Kentucky. They were Quakers. And the two stories, one was that they sold them downriver, and the other that they freed them. His aunt, her real name was Bertha Gertrude, but she was always called Claire May, which was the name of her black mammy, whom everyone loved. And I should think my husband, who would say to me, "A woman is less than a slave," Aristotle said. And so I was, and I used to think at least my family was free of that. And then I realized I have one Jewish ancestor who actually paid off the English national debt, Samson Gideon. And then I learned that even all of that wealth he had came from Jamaican slave wealth. So I think we need to know that we are all implicated. I, as an Anglo-Irish woman, am implicated in the genocide of Ireland. And we need to live with that knowledge and in our lives try to make reparations, try to bring back justice. Um, and I think that's the only way to heal the cracks in the world.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And I think that for us, the dialogue with you and with the cemetery has always been a really rich way of thinking through the layers of history that just don't tend to really appear. And there's so many layers of history. There are so many connections that you make, and I think it's really important to think about the ways in which. A lot of times when we think about Blackness in the context of Italy, especially as we move back in time, we're talking about elements and fragments of history that are very often under-recorded when they are recorded. And so the sort of testament that you speak of with the Nubian slave who is buried at the cemetery is really remarkable, because in a certain sense, sometimes I think that what we are left with are these fragments that tell us of a presence that was here, and we have to engage in certain theoretical speculation to really arrive at the significance of these figures. But we have to also at the same time be grateful that there's a trace that has been left at all, because it's more often that there isn't. And so, I'm really thankful and really interested also in thinking more about that grave site and the significance of that, and ways of sort of diving into those family histories as a way of really engaging what those histories stand for.
Yes, and I love the story of Lady Sarah, who was Queen Victoria's goddaughter. And there's this absolutely beautiful picture of her in her wedding dress. She's exquisite. Black is beautiful.
Mhm.
And my Anglican convent, the brother of the Mother Foundress, was head of a theological college in Umtata, which is now in one of the Bantu states and is gone. But he was educating Black ordinands. And I had this gorgeous scrapbook in my convent of the photographs of these couples, the brides in their white Edwardian wedding dresses with their husbands beautifully dressed. That's the tradition out of which Desmond Tutu came, the sense of the dignity of people through the correct reading of the gospel, which is for the other, the slave, the Samaritan, the leper, the woman, and so forth. If we can equalize and honor the other, and never treat people like garbage, like spazzatura, like rubbish. If we do that, we are that ourselves.
So thank you so much. I think we can kind of come to a close now. And so I want to thank you again for really bringing forth this conversation and, you know, as a form of also continuity, despite the fact that we couldn't come to the cemetery to you this year. I think it's really great to have been connected nonetheless and to continue the dialogue and continue to grow and to learn together. And so I thank you all in the audience for the wonderful questions, and the conversation was recorded, and the link will be made available to everyone so that you can follow up. And of course, once it's possible for those of you that are not in Florence, I invite you all to come and visit the cemetery and to meet with Julia, who has plenty more to share.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Too.